Hillary Rodham Clinton. So, Secretary Clinton, I guess the secret is out. We're really glad you're here tonight. A forum like this comes along all too seldom, but tonight it gives us a chance to say something to you that we all share. We are so very blessed by the manner in which you have integrated your faith journey into your life's work. From the days of your formation in a Methodist Sunday school until today, your faith has provided a focus for all that you have done, and it's been an inspiration for those of us who have longed to see the integration of public policy with issues of social justice, holiness, and that which is good and right and holy. And because events like this don't happen very often, we wanted to say in very clear and simple terms these things to you. We praise God for who you are. We thank you for the ways in which you have blessed so many people across the world. We continue to pray for you as we have been, especially in these past few months. And most of all, Sister Hillary, we love you.
Thanks, Bishop. Well, how's that for a beginning?
It's wonderful being here. It's a great beginning. Thank you.
Well, tonight we are so grateful for your willingness to be present and to share some of your faith journey. It's not like you've never shared it before, but in this particular moment, it seems particularly important for us to be making these connections between our faith and our public life, our service, and the way we feel our lives are being led. So thank you for being willing to be here tonight to share your perspective and your connection to all of that. And as I said, anyone who's been paying attention knows that you are a person of faith, but it's sometimes good to remind them of some of your history. And so if you wouldn't mind just to share briefly kind of where you have come from, how did the church impact you? What is it that really grounds you in your faith and has given you the strong foundation that has allowed you to do all that you have done and to stand so strong in the midst of so much?
Well, first, let me thank Riverside for opening up this magnificent church, which is really a community to all of us tonight. And to everyone here, thank you for supporting Camp Olmsted, which is such a great mission of the City Society of the Methodist Church here in New York. And Bishop, thank you for your kind remarks and for your leadership. Thanks to Dr. Amy Butler, the lead pastor of Riverside, and thanks to Reverend Ginger for coming from the church that I used to attend when I lived in Washington, and the church I would have gone back to had I been able to live in Washington again. I am very grateful for my upbringing in the Methodist Church and in a community of faith. My earliest years really set me on that path because for me growing up in my family, there was your family, there was your school, there was your church. And we spent a lot of time in church as children and as teenagers because there was such a commitment to the nurturing of young people, our hearts, our souls, our minds, and I was blessed by excellent teachers and a youth minister whom I have written about many times before, spoken about, who helped not only myself, but others when we were impressionable in the junior high years and high school, really be challenged about our faith and the role that our faith could and should play in the world. This youth minister, his name was Don Jones, Reverend Don Jones, was young and vital. He drove a convertible, and so we thought he was just the coolest thing ever. He'd been in the Navy before he went to divinity school, and he was intent upon making sure that those of us who lived in our middle-class community, which was all white, knew that there was a bigger world out there. And he arranged exchanges between the young people in our church with churches in inner city Chicago, African American churches, Latino churches, and then one memorable day, we used to we had Wednesday night Methodist Youth Fellowship, we had Sunday night Methodist Youth Fellowship, we had lots of activities in between. He said that he would take those who got permission from their families to go hear Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speak at Orchestra Hall in Chicago. And I was thrilled. We had just started hearing about Dr. King, and the idea that we would hear somebody that was becoming such an important figure in our country was exciting. Now, some of the families of some of the students would not give them permission to go. But I was lucky enough that I got to go down on our church bus with a group of our other friends from church to hear Dr. King speak. And the sermon that night is one that he gave on other occasions called Staying Awake Through the Revolution. And some of you might remember it. It was well known. And we stood in a long line to go and shake Dr. King's hand. I tell you that story because what I cherish about my church life as a young person is how it wasn't just a continuing inculcation, a statement of what we were supposed to believe. It was, here is what we hope you will believe, you will come to with your own free will, but we want to expose you to the broader world so that you will make the decisions about your faith consistent with the opportunity to be a witness, to be evidencing in your daily life what your faith means to you. And it was just such a gift that I carry it with me, to this day. And it's not always easy, as you know so well, Ginger, to figure out how best to translate your faith into your daily life, whether you're a preacher or you're in politics or whatever it might be.
Well, and it seems right now, one of the things that I've thought about so much is how difficult it seems to me to be as a person in public life, in public service, to think about how you speak about, how you share, how you integrate your faith with your public service, what you say. Do you say anything about it? Do you not say anything about it? Do the words matter? Is it mostly the actions? How does that really work? And how has that worked how have you managed that over the course of many, many years in the public eye and in public service? How do you do that? How does your faith really impact not just your personal life, but also your public and political positions, commitments, and choices?
Well, I hope, and I try to have it be integrated and to inform my public life. I was raised to believe that actions spoke louder than words, and if you were a person of faith, that should be evident in how you treated other people and what kind of life you lived. So I didn't go around talking about it a lot, but it certainly was foremost in my mind, and I've tried to express it, sometimes more effectively than other times over the course of the last 20 or 30 years. But I've tried to be guided by it even more importantly. I write in this new book that I have coming out called What Happened, that there was a real well, thank you. There was a real misconnection between who I am, what I believe, and the kind of campaign that we saw in our country the last year ago. I knew that there were people who were angry and people who had resentments. I understood that, I could see it, but I did not believe, and I'm just not wired to think that the best way for a leader to bring people together to solve problems is to stoke that anger and to feed that resentment. And so I will tell you, I think that the kind of leadership I was offering was not satisfying enough for certain people. And it wasn't enough for me to say, look, I understand, and here's what I want to do to help, if I didn't display more anger so that they could feel that I got their anger. And I think that is a legitimate question about what happened in that campaign in 2016. And it was something that I struggled with because I don't think anger is a strategy. It is certainly justified in the face of what we see oftentimes in our society. But I think leaders, whether it's in the church or in politics or anywhere else, should be looking for ways to try to find common ground or even higher ground, and not to create scapegoats and stoke hatred and bigotry and prejudice and the like. So I've tried to live that. During the campaign, I started talking a lot about love, which I know some people thought, what is she talking about? But I thought
crazy concept. Talking
crazy
about
concept.
Love. Crazy
yeah.
woman, you.
I know, and
I know.
I mean, I remember the first day I got to college. We got from the chapel. I went to Wellesley College, a women's college outside of Boston. We got some Wellesley people here. I got a little card. I'll never forget it. I saved it for years. A little card which said, "God is love," and so we talked about love in a community concept, a public concept, and it was challenging to do that because there is a large group of people with a very strong opinion that if you're a Christian, if you profess your faith, you can only have one set of political beliefs. And if you deviate from those political beliefs, you somehow are not really a Christian. I reject that completely.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, one of the things we were just talking about a few minutes ago before we came out is just that very thing, the way that Christianity is getting portrayed and the way that it's being put forward in the public square as something that, from my perspective certainly, it is not. It's so important for us to have voices like yours and other prominent voices that are able to reject that and to offer an alternative. So in the midst of something that was so counter to your faith, and you were facing these days where you must have just felt like you were hitting your head against the wall, so frustrating. I mean, can you think of certain moments when it was just like, I don't know how to counter this? And in those moments, how did your faith play a role to help you push through? What were the resources that you brought to those moments when you thought, it's too much, it's too hard, and I mean, how did your spiritual life really feed you in those moments?
Well, I'll pick one example because it was probably the most dramatic, and that is when I lost. That was devastating. I didn't think I would lose. The two best politicians I know, my husband and Barack Obama, did not think I would lose. And so when it happened, it just threw me back and threw me onto my own internal resources, and I knew that I had to get up the morning after the election and I had to demonstrate the kind of personal composure and strength in order to deliver a concession speech, but to do it in a way that, you know, wasn't bitter or angry. And I tried very hard to do that, and I also tried to make it clear that we all hoped that the new president would succeed, that we wanted to give him a chance. But as soon as Bill and I left that stage, I just, you know, really felt the whole weight of it on me. And we were in the back seat of the car on our way back to our home. I couldn't speak. I couldn't really have any internal resources left. And so when I write in the book about getting through that period, I relied on several tools, one of which was prayer. And I was lifted up and blessed by a lot of people who sent me prayers, sent me spiritual readings. I also had the support of my family. I got to see the world anew from the eyes of my grandchildren. My friends rallied around and were so supportive. I did some yoga. Try alternate nostril breathing. I highly recommend it.
Oh, good job. That was tricky.
Kind of calms you down.
That one's tricky.
And yes, I had my fair share of Chardonnay. So. And you know, because of what I went through, and because I know that every person suffers loss, they suffer disappointment. They may not do it on the international stage running for president, but every one of us knows what that sense of deep discouragement feels like. I write about it because I hope that in some way it can give support, comfort to people who've gone through their own times of loss. And I took a lot of long walks, which I also believe was very healing through a lot of days, all kinds of weather. And I decided to write a book, which was as much for me as for anybody else, trying to make sense of it, trying to come to grips with it, trying to find out what happened, and then understand it and explain it. And that was really hard. It was painful to relive it. It was excruciating to try to write it. Sometimes I would write a couple of pages, and I'd literally have to go lie down because it was so difficult. But eventually it became cathartic. And through that whole process, and I try to describe this in the book, I had devotionals, I had great writings from people whose faith I respect. Some of it's in the book, some of it is not. I read a great book of a conversation between the Dalai Lama and Bishop Tutu of South Africa about joy. I reread a book that I had first read during another difficult time in my life in the late 90s by Henry Nouwen, a Jesuit priest. I read several of his books, but the one in particular was about, was the parable of the prodigal son. And in it, he talks about the discipline of gratitude. Now, if you're a Methodist, you know we have a book of discipline. And, we're methodical, and we try to be disciplined. And so the whole concept of the discipline of gratitude just struck such a chord with me. So I began every day reminding myself of what I was grateful for and reaching out to try to connect with others and support others. I was very worried when the campaign ended, and I was very worried that young people, particularly young women, would be really devastated and discouraged to the point that they would not remain active or become active. And so I began thinking about ways I could support that kind of activism. And through it all, my faith was really holding me together in a very central way. And it gave me a lot of courage to get up and keep going, and I'm very grateful for that.
As you were describing the process of writing the book, it really reminded me of that the writing itself became a spiritual discipline, and that it was itself a form of prayer and of service. As you think about you were thinking about those that would receive your words and read your words, be hopefully encouraged and inspired by them. So what a beautiful gift, and such a concrete expression of faith, even though it may not be framed that way. I don't know, but again, drawing some of that into it, I'm so looking forward to reading it. Since the election, you've said that you have, I'm assuming that this book has helped you sort of come to a place where you're feeling okay personally.
Yes.
But that you continue to have deep concerns for our nation. You are not alone. And in what would have been your hometown, we've been struggling in all sorts of ways to try to respond, as people across the nation have been. But I'm wondering what words of advice or encouragement, or what you just want to say about that, first of all, and secondly, what advice or encouragement you might have for folk who seem at this point, folks are feeling really compelled by their faith right now to stand up and to engage, to resist, and to take some risks, perhaps, that they wouldn't have taken in the past. And so I'm just curious what you'd like to say to this gathered body and to folk across the country who are trying to be putting their faith in action in this really fraught and challenging moment in our national life.
Well, as you said, you and I were talking about this because, for those of you who don't know, Foundry Methodist Church in Washington, it's a venerable church that's been on the forefront of a lot of social change, and it's a very welcoming and supportive congregation, but also a challenging one. And I think for those of us who are people of faith, knowing that this is a time when we are called to find our own truth and to be willing to express it, whether it is in some kind of volunteer activity, supporting the camp with generous contributions, speaking out, going to the Women's March, doing whatever it is to demonstrate that you are living your faith through a form of witness. And I'm going to turn the tables on Ginger for a minute, because she told me that since the election at her church, they've been engaged in what they call sacred resistance. And I think it's important to let her just say a few words about this, because for people of faith, that is one way to conceptualize how you can be active on behalf of causes, on behalf of people who need your voice and your support. I am doing what I can through a new organization I started called Onward Together to support new grassroots organizations and to lift them up, to find the next generation of concerned citizens, activists, organizers, to give them funding, to give them guidance, because we need a lot of activity at the grassroots level. We need people in every community standing up and speaking out. And there is so much to be concerned about. Yes, I am okay, but I am worried. I'm worried that we face a continuing deliberate effort to undermine our values and our institutions as Americans. And it is something that we cannot stay silent about or be on the sidelines about. But there are so many different ways of serving. I like to say resist, insist, persist, enlist. And actually the enlist may be the most important of those four. Enlist in doing something that brings you together with people who not only are like you, but maybe not like you. We have got to start breaking down these barriers, and it is imperative that we speak across all the lines that divide us. Now, I'm not saying that there's going to be miracles and people are all going to have epiphanies, but I am saying if we don't even listen to one another, if we don't solicit reasoned discussion, we are not laying the groundwork for the kind of change we need. And of course, ultimately, we need to vote. Voting is the #1 act of resistance to whatever you don't agree with, or persistence on behalf of what you do. But Ginger, would you say a few words about sacred resistance at Foundry?
Sure. So after the election, one of the things we realized is that we needed to mobilize. We expected that there were going to be ongoing challenges, not short-term challenges, and that there would be many of them. And we were concerned about burnout and not having the structure and the support to sort of make sure we stayed with it. And so organized a community of folk that, in DC, we like to organize and advocate for things. So that's what some folks at Foundry did. And every week since just before the inauguration, we were able to get organized after the election, and just before the inauguration, there's been a team of folk who've been identifying a particular place and way in which people could concretely act that week. And we've been publishing that along with supporting materials so people could educate themselves on whatever the issue was and then know exactly what they could do. They didn't have to sort through all of the news. They didn't have to try to figure out which cause was most important that week. They could go, okay, this is something I can do, and I'm going to do it every week, and if I do that, at least I know I'm staying engaged. So we were trying to provide some resources for people in what can feel so overwhelming. And and sometimes in those moments there's so much, it feels very tempting to say, well, I'll just do nothing. And we wanted to try to help people not do that. So.
Well, I'm so glad to hear you say that because, as we are reminded in Galatians, do not grow weary when doing good, because in due season you will see the results of your work. And it is hard, it's exhausting to stand up and say, don't talk about people like that. Don't treat people like that. Don't insult and demean a whole group of people. Don't take the most recent example, there are so many. Don't take the opportunity for the future of 800,000 dreamers who love and only know this country away from them. And you have to ask, where does that cruelty, that mean-spiritedness come from? It is not from the church. It is not from Christianity. It is not from people of faith. Yes, there are problems, but these are problems we're supposed to work together to achieve solutions for. And it is so important to sustain that onward effort of sacred resistance and find a home for you to do that. That's why having it rooted in churches, as it was in the anti-slavery movement, as it was in the civil rights movement, as it has been in other points in our history, enables you, when you do grow weary, to rest a while because others are coming forward to carry the load, and then you get your energy back and you get your faith rejuvenated, and then you can go forward. But we should not cede an inch on these moral and ethical and humanitarian issues that are rooted in what our faith tells us is right.
I was struck when you just said it's not the church, it's not Christianity, because again, I come back to the fact that so many in the public square do think that these sort of hateful, because of what's happening right now in the public square, that these sort of hateful, judgmental, send them home, build a wall, launch a bomb, that all of that is somehow justified by the Christian faith. And again, I think it's so important for those of us of faith and conscience who've been baptized into a church that says resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves, to stand up and say that's not Christianity, that's not the church, that's not the Church of Jesus Christ. So it's a real challenge right now in both politics and in church. I mean, we're really in a struggle for the soul of our church and our nation.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think using that language for a dialogue about what is at risk and what is at stake elevates it. It's not just politics. It's not just who gets elected and what they say or what they do, or if they're in the Congress, what they vote for. Think about this. There is a persistent effort to disenfranchise millions of Americans. African Americans, elderly Americans, young Americans. It has been going on for years, but with the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, this was the first election where it was in full force. And we're beginning to see more and more stories come out about what happened to people who had every right to vote in the election and were turned away, who came with their identification, as an 85-year-old woman did in Milwaukee, but she didn't have a photo ID, she doesn't drive anymore. But she came with her Social Security card, her utility bills, she came with education. She was turned away. Story after story. Because back in the 60s, and even before in the 50s, but with great urgency in the 60s, this country finally said voting is a sacred right. Voting is what enables every person to be equal in our country. It doesn't matter how rich or how poor, what color, what gender, anything else. In that voting booth, you are equal. We should be celebrating that, not suppressing it. And so part of our challenge has to be going after these techniques that are being used to undermine the full citizenship, indeed the humanity of so many of our fellow Americans. It is going to take a lot of individual efforts and some concerted ones to stand up against this, because it's exhausting. It's exhausting having to stand up and say, that's not right. Don't do that. You're hurting people. Stop. I mean, who gets in a Twitter war with Pope Francis?
Come on now.
I mean, go figure, really. But what we are trying to convey, what we stand for, is so much bigger than any one of us, and that's why we need a community. That's why we need to support each other. And it is reason to be optimistic. It really is, to be hopeful and optimistic, because that great arc of justice that we have tried so hard to follow with our faults and our setbacks keeps moving toward a better life, a better time, a better place on this earth as well as after. And on this earth, God's work is our own. And so we are not just doing it for Hillary or Ginger or Amy or anyone individually. We are doing it because we are part of this great cloud of witness that hangs over us. And yes, I think ultimately judges us, but it is there to guide us in the right direction. On the back of your program, there's something that I said when I spoke at Foundry last year.
Oh, when was that?
It was a long time ago.
It was a while ago. Yeah, it was a while ago. A couple of years, maybe.
But I said, no matter who you are, where you come from, what your income, your race, your religion, your gender, your age, your ability, you have value, you have dignity, you have something to offer. And so we can't let our politics dehumanize anyone among us, because to diminish one of us diminishes all of us. And therefore, we have to be constantly speaking out with not anger, but passion, commitment, good cheer if you can manage it, and not be silenced. One thing I would ask each of you who is here, whether you are religious or whatever religion you might be, whether you're a person of faith or not, you are here because you are part of a larger community than yourself. If you're a member of this great church, and I first came here when Jim Forbes was preaching back in the day, and I have seen the dynamic spirituality that Riverside represents, we need more people to join us in speaking out and resisting and insisting and persisting and enlisting in the struggles that are ahead of us. But we should do it with, a song in our heart. We can't be turned into the mirror image of the people who are peddling hate and bigotry and bias and prejudice and paranoia.
don't become the thing you hate, right? Don't let yourself become the thing you hate. Well, tonight we've been given a vision of one who has stood in the midst of so much with an extraordinary amount of strength and grace, and that we know has been grounded in faith. And we thank you so, so much.
Thank you all.
I'm going to invite. Reverend Kevin Wright of the Riverside Church in the city of New York will now help us bring our time together to a close.
I invite all those who were on the team that supported Secretary Clinton with prayers and encouragement to come up at this time. And let me say that I had the privilege of meeting Secretary Clinton a few months ago, and when I did, she made a joke about the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Imagine that. Some people can't even pronounce 2 Corinthians, and she's making jokes about the Pentateuch. Let us pray. God of our understanding, we give you thanks for Secretary Clinton, for the way that she has served others and fought for others, has fought for justice so faithfully throughout her life. We pray that you would continue to use her as a beacon of justice in our nation. Be with each person here. Send us out to love and to serve and to be a community that cares for those around us. We prayed this together. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.